Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The October air bit through my jacket as I settled into my tree stand at 4 in the morning. I'd been hunting these woods for 15 years, knew every trail, every clearing, every spot where deer liked to bed down. My name's Michael, and at 38 I thought I'd seen everything these woods had to offer. God knows I was wrong about that. The morning passed slow and cold. I watched squirrels chase each other through the canopy, listened to turkeys calling from the ridge. Normal forest sounds. By noon, I'd eaten both sandwiches I'd packed and was starting to wonder if this would be one of those empty-handed days. Then around 3:30, just when the light started taking on that golden quality, I spotted movement through the trees. A buck, decent size, picking his way through the undergrowth about 80 yards out. My hands moved on muscle memory, rifle up, safety off, crosshairs steady on his shoulder. The shot rang out clean and true. He dropped where he stood, maybe took 2 steps before his legs gave out. I waited 20 minutes before climbing down, giving him time to expire fully. No sense rushing things. The walk to where he lay took longer than expected. The afternoon shadows were already stretching long between the trees, and I realized with a start that I'd been in my stand for nearly 12 hours. My legs protested as I knelt beside the deer, a solid 5-pointer, probably close to 200 pounds dressed out. The field dressing went quick, but by the time I finished, the sun was touching the horizon. That's when the first twinge of worry hit me. 5 miles back to my truck, and darkness coming fast. I'd left my game cart stashed about 2 miles from the stand, tucked behind a fallen oak where I always left it. The drag to the cart left me winded, sweat cooling on my back despite the dropping temperature. My shoulders burned from hauling the deer by his antlers, and I kept having to switch hands every 50 yards or so. The cart sat right where I'd left it, covered in a light dusting of leaves. I should have inspected it closer, should have noticed how the left wheel had developed a hairline crack over the summer. But I was tired, getting nervous about the fading light, and just wanted to load up and get moving. I managed to wrestle the deer onto the cart's platform, using bungee cords to secure him. The first 100 yards went fine. The trail here was relatively smooth, just a few roots and rocks to navigate around. Then I hit a section where last week's rain had washed channels across the path. The cart bucked and jumped, and I heard a sound like a branch snapping. The left wheel exploded off the axle, sending the cart tilting hard to one side. The deer's weight shifted, nearly pulling the whole thing over. I grabbed the handle with both hands, fighting to keep it upright, but it was no use. The wheel bounced away into the underbrush, and I stood there staring at the mangled axle, my breath coming in clouds in the rapidly cooling air. No spare wheel. No way to fix it. No cell signal this deep in the woods. I checked my phone anyway. Nothing but a black screen where the signal bars should be. The reality of my situation started to sink in. 3 miles to go, full dark in maybe 30 minutes, and 200 pounds of fresh meat that every predator in these woods would smell from miles away. I've carried deer before, but never this far. You sling them over your shoulders, front legs on one side, back legs on the other, head hanging down your back. The first few 100 yards, you tell yourself it's not so bad. Your legs are strong, your back can take it. You've hauled heavier things, but after half a mile, the weight starts to compound. Every step drives the carcass down onto your spine. The blood that hasn't fully drained soaks through your jacket, cold and sticky against your skin. Your breathing gets labored, not just from exertion, but from the pressure on your chest. I had to stop every 200 yards or so, easing the deer to the ground and straightening my back until the vertebrae popped. The forest had gone completely dark now, and my headlamp carved out a narrow tunnel of light ahead. Outside that beam, the woods pressed in black and absolute. That's when I noticed how quiet everything had become. No owl calls, no rustling of small animals in the leaves. Even the wind had died to nothing. just my own ragged breathing and the soft thud of my boots on the trail. The silence felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. I hoisted the deer back up and kept moving. The trail here wound through a section of old growth, massive oaks and maples that had probably been here since before my grandfather's time. In daylight, it was beautiful. In the dark, with 200 pounds of dead weight on my back, those trees felt like they were leaning in, watching. Then, from somewhere off to my left, came the first howl. Coyotes. We'd been having problems with them for the past few years, big packs moving down from the north as development pushed them out of their traditional territories. Most times they kept their distance from humans, but a fresh kill was different. That was an invitation. The howl started low, almost mournful, then climbed to a sharp yip 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 that made my skin crawl. Within seconds, another voice joined from the right, then another behind me. They were spreading out, testing, seeing how I'd react. I picked up my pace, ignoring the fire in my legs and the way the deer's weight made each step a struggle. The trail dipped here, heading down toward the marshy area I'd have to cross before hitting the last climb to the road. My headlamp beam wavered as I half jogged, half stumbled down the slope. More howls now, closer. I could hear them moving through the underbrush, not even trying to be quiet about it. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. They were keeping pace with me, maybe 30 yards out on either side. My right hand found the handle of the hatchet on my belt, though what good that would do against a whole pack, I didn't want to think about. The howling suddenly stopped, and somehow that was worse. Now I could hear them breathing, hear the soft pad of paws on leaves. My headlamp caught pairs of eyes reflecting green in the darkness. 1 set, 2, 5, 8. They were all around me now, tightening the circle with each step I took. I tried to remember everything I'd read about coyote behavior. Don't run. That triggers the chase instinct. Make yourself big and loud. But how do you look big with 200 pounds of deer on your back? How do you shout threats when you can barely breathe? The ground went soft under my boots, and I knew I'd reached the edge of the swamp. In spring, this whole area flooded. Now, in October, it was a maze of mud, standing water, and grass hummocks that could turn an ankle or swallow a boot. In daylight, you picked your way careful, testing each step. In the dark, pursued by predators, it was a nightmare. My first step sank ankle-deep in black mud that reeked of decay. The deer's weight drove me deeper, and for a terrifying second, I thought I'd stick fast. I wrenched my foot free with a wet sucking sound and stumbled forward, trying to find solid ground. The coyotes had reached the swamp edge too. I could hear them splashing, whining with frustration as they hit the deeper water. But they didn't stop. They knew the land better than I did, knew the solid paths through the mire. While I floundered and crashed through the muck, they moved like ghosts, appearing and disappearing in my headlamp beam. Water seeped through my boots, ice cold and thick with mud. The deer on my back felt like it had doubled in weight, driving me down with each struggling step. My headlamp flickered, water in the connections, or maybe the batteries starting to fail. The thought of being out here in total darkness made my stomach clench. A coyote materialized directly in front of me, maybe 15 feet away. Bigger than any coyote had a right to be, ribs showing through matted fur, eyes reflecting that sick green light. It didn't attack, just stood there, head low, lips pulled back from yellowed teeth. Waiting. They were all waiting, letting the swamp do their work for them, wearing me down step by muddy step. I drew the hatchet with my free hand, the other still gripping the deer's legs. "Get back!" My voice came out as barely more than a wheeze. The coyote tilted its head, almost like it was laughing at me. Then it melted back into the darkness, and I pushed forward through the sucking mud. Halfway through the swamp, my strength started to fail. My legs shook with each step, muscles cramping from the constant strain. The deer felt like it was made of lead, crushing down on my spine until I could barely stand upright. But stopping here meant sinking into the mud, meant giving the pack the opening they were waiting for. They were getting bolder. One darted in from the left, snapping at the deer's hanging head before dancing back out of hatchet range. Another circled behind, so close I could smell its wet dog stench over the swamp rot. They were testing, probing, looking for the moment when I'd finally collapse. My headlamp chose that moment to die completely. The darkness slammed down like a physical weight. No moon, no stars through the canopy, just absolute black. I froze, heart hammering, trying to get my bearings. The coyotes went silent too, probably as surprised as I was. Then I heard them moving again, splashing through the water, circling tighter. I forced myself to move, navigating by feel and memory. Mud, water, the occasional solid spot. The fence line should be ahead somewhere, maybe another 100 yards. If I could reach that, get over it, maybe they'd give up. Maybe. Something bumped against my leg. Not an attack, just a brushing past, letting me know how close they were. My free hand swung the hatchet in a wild arc, hitting nothing but air. They were playing with me now, running me like they'd run a deer, waiting for exhaustion to drop me. Then my boot hit something solid. Not mud, not water, gravel. The old logging road that ran along the fence line. I'd made it through the swamp. The fence loomed up out of the darkness, a deeper black against black. Chain link 8 feet high, topped with barbed wire. The property line between the hunting grounds and the McCarthy farm. I'd never been so happy to see a fence in my life. But now I had a new problem. How to get over it with 200 pounds of dead weight and a pack of coyotes snapping at my heels. They sensed the trap too, the dead end I'd walked into. The splashing behind me intensified, multiple animals rushing forward. No more time for thinking. I grabbed the fence with both hands, deer still on my back, and started climbing. The chain link bit into my fingers, already numb from cold and exertion. The deer's weight pulled me backward, threatening to tear me off the fence. Behind me, jaws snapped where my legs had been a second before. A coyote hit the fence hard enough to shake the whole section, its weight making the metal sing. Somehow I got a leg over the top, barbed wire tearing through my pants and into flesh. The pain gave me the last burst of adrenaline I needed. I hauled myself over, deer and all, and let gravity take us. The landing drove all the air from my lungs, sent lightning through my knees and back. The deer rolled off me, and I scrambled for my dropped hatchet, sure the pack would be over the fence in seconds. But they didn't come. I heard them hitting the fence, claws scrabbling on metal, frustrated whines and snarls. But they didn't come over. Whether it was the height, the barbed wire, or some invisible boundary they wouldn't cross, I didn't know and didn't care. I lay there in the gravel, gasping, feeling blood seep from the cuts on my leg. Safe. Somehow, impossibly safe. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, someone was shining a flashlight in my face. I came up swinging, still clutching the hatchet, before my eyes focused on the uniformed figure standing over me. Department of Natural Resources. Officer James Mitchell, according to his name tag. Young guy, maybe mid-20s, looking at me like I'd crawled out of a nightmare. Which I suppose I had. Sir? Sir, are you all right? Can you tell me your name? It took 2 tries to get my voice working. Michael Porter. I have permits, deer tags, in my wallet. He glanced at the deer lying beside me, at the blood on my clothes, the tears in my pants. Sir, have you been out here all night? I managed to tell him the story, or at least the parts that made sense. The broken cart, the long carry, the coyotes. He listened, his expression shifting from concern to something like awe. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. That's quite a night. You sure you're not hurt? Those cuts look pretty deep. I'm fine. Just tired. Just need to get to my truck. He helped me load the deer into his DNR vehicle and drove me the last half-mile to where I'd parked. My truck sat there covered in dew, looking like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We transferred the deer, and Officer Mitchell stood there shaking his head. 20 years I've been doing this job, he said. Never heard of coyotes acting like that. Pack hunting a human. You're lucky, Mr. Porter. Damn lucky. Lucky. I thought about that word as I sat in my truck after he left, watching the sun paint the trees gold. Lucky to be alive, sure. But something had changed in those woods. Something fundamental. The coyotes weren't acting like coyotes anymore. They were organized, patient, almost intelligent in their tactics. I drove home with the deer in the back, already planning to process it myself rather than take it to the butcher in town. I didn't want to explain the claw marks, the torn hide, the evidence of just how close it had been. Some stories you keep to yourself, but I still hunt those woods. Call it stubbornness, call it stupidity, but I won't let one bad night drive me out of places I've known since I was a boy. I'm more careful now, though. I check my equipment, carry backup gear, never hunt alone near dusk. And sometimes, on quiet mornings in the stand, I hear them howling in the distance. Not the normal yip and call of coyotes, but something else. Something that remembers and waits and plans. The woods have changed, and so have I. But the hunt continues. The grandfather clock in my living room struck 1:30, its deep chimes echoing through the empty house. I jerked awake from where I dozed off at my kitchen table, red pen still clutched in my cramped fingers, a stack of 7th grade history essays scattered before me like fallen leaves. The house groaned around me, old wood settling in the desert wind that had been howling for hours. That's when I heard it. A deliberate scratching at the back door, followed by a low whine that made my skin crawl. The sound was familiar, yet wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. My heart hammered against my ribs as I recognized the pattern. 3 scratches, pause, whine, repeat. It was exactly how my dog used to beg to come inside. But Ranger had been missing for 4 days now, lost during the worst sandstorm this part of Arizona had seen in decades. The storm had turned day to night, visibility dropping to mere feet as walls of sand engulfed everything. When it finally passed, Ranger was gone. I'd searched everywhere, called his name until my throat was raw, posted flyers throughout the reservation. Nothing. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a screech that seemed unnaturally loud. The scratching came again, more insistent now, accompanied by that terrible whining. Every instinct screamed at me to stay where I was. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my memory. She'd always told me never to answer unexpected knocks after midnight, especially out here where the desert held too many secrets. The kitchen felt smaller as I approached the back door, shadows seeming to press in from all sides. Through the thin curtain covering the window, I could make out a familiar silhouette. My heart leaped with desperate hope, then plummeted into ice-cold terror. The shape was wrong. The proportions didn't match the dog I'd raised from a puppy. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peer outside. There, illuminated by the weak porch light, stood what looked like Ranger. Same brown and white coat, same distinctive markings, same collar. But his body appeared stretched, elongated in ways that defied anatomy. His legs bent at impossible angles, and when he turned his head toward the window, his eyes reflected the light with an unnatural amber glow that seemed to burn from within. My breath fogged the glass as I stumbled backward. The thing outside tilted its head with jerky mechanical movements, then opened its mouth. Too many teeth gleamed in the porch light. Sharp, yellowed fangs that belonged in no dog's mouth. The whining grew louder, more desperate, but underneath it I heard something else. A wet, clicking sound, like someone struggling to speak with a mouthful of saliva. The door handle rattled violently. Once, twice, then a sustained attack that made the entire frame shake. I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers, nearly dropping it twice before managing to dial 911. The rings seemed to last forever. 911, what's your emergency? Something's outside my house, I whispered, afraid to speak louder. It looks like my dog, but it's not. Please send someone. What's your address, sir? I gave her my location, my voice barely audible over the renewed scratching and that horrible whining. Above me, something began walking across the roof. Slow, deliberate footsteps that creaked the old metal sheeting. Each step sent vibrations through the house, and I realized with growing horror that whatever was up there was far heavier than any dog should be. Officers are en route. Stay inside and keep your doors locked. The line went dead. I stood frozen in my kitchen, listening to the thing pacing overhead. Dust rained down from the ceiling with each footfall. Then came a new sound, a gentle tapping against the skylight above the sink. When I looked up, a shadow moved against the glass. Something was pressing its face against the window, leaving smears that caught the moonlight. I couldn't stay. Every fiber of my being screamed to get out of that house. Grabbing my keys from the counter, I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and stumbling into the cool desert night. The wind hit me like a slap, carrying the scent of sage and something else. Something rotten and sweet that made my stomach lurch. My pickup truck sat in the driveway like salvation. I yanked open the door and threw myself inside, jamming the key into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine turned over on the second try, headlights blazing to life and cutting through the darkness. I threw it in reverse and gunned the engine, gravel spraying as I backed out onto the dirt road. In my rearview mirror, I saw movement on the roof. The creature slid down the slope of metal sheeting with impossible grace, landing silently in the dust where my truck had been parked moments before. It stood upright for a heartbeat, a grotesque parody of my beloved dog, before dropping to all fours and giving chase. The speedometer climbed, 30, 40, 50 miles per hour down the winding desert road. Behind me, the thing kept pace effortlessly, its distorted form loping alongside the truck with movements that hurt to watch. Its joints bent wrong, its spine curved in ways that should have crippled it. Yet it moved with fluid efficiency through the scrub brush and around the scattered boulders. My hands were welded to the steering wheel, knuckles white with strain. The desert rushed past in the headlights, endless stretches of sand and rock, towering mesas that stood like silent judges against the star-filled sky. This was my home, land I'd known all my life, but tonight it felt alien and hostile. The creature's eyes glowed in my peripheral vision, twin amber points of light that never wavered from their focus on me. When I risked a direct look, I saw its mouth hanging open, long tongue lolling out, but the expression on its face was wrong. Too intelligent, too knowing. As if something else was looking out through those familiar features, studying me with predatory intent. My phone buzzed. Officer Henderson's voice crackled through the speaker. "I'm at the gas station on Route 264. Can you make it there?" "It's following me," I gasped, checking the mirror again. The creature had fallen back slightly but was still there, still running with that horrible fluid grace. "It won't stop. Just keep driving. Don't slow down for anything." The lights of town appeared ahead like a beacon. The gas station's fluorescent floods turned the parking lot into a pool of harsh white light that felt like sanctuary after the oppressive darkness of the desert. I skidded to a stop next to Henderson's patrol car, the officer already standing beside his vehicle with one hand resting on his weapon. As I climbed out of my truck on unsteady legs, I looked back toward the darkness I'd escaped. The creature stood at the very edge of the light, just visible as a shadow against shadow. For a long moment, it remained motionless, watching. Then it turned and melted back into the night, disappearing so completely it might never have been there at all. Henderson approached slowly, his eyes scanning the desert beyond the lights. "I saw it," he said quietly. "Been getting reports about things like this for weeks now. Animals acting strange, pets going missing." He paused, studying my face. "This isn't the first time." Dawn came gray and reluctant, the sun struggling to penetrate a layer of dust that still hung in the air from the recent storm. Henderson and I sat in the diner on Main Street, the only customers at this early hour, nursing coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since yesterday. My hands shook as I lifted the cup to my lips. "There's an old mine shaft about 5 miles north of your place," Henderson said, unfolding a topographic map on the sticky table between us. "Been abandoned since the 70s. If that thing has made some kind of dent out there." He didn't finish the thought, but I understood. Whatever was wearing my dog's face had to have come from somewhere, and the honeycombs of abandoned mines that riddled this part of the desert offered plenty of hiding places for things that preferred the dark. "We could try to trap it," I suggested, the plan forming as I spoke. "Use something it wants as bait." Henderson nodded slowly. "Your dog's collar, maybe. Something with his scent." He folded the map carefully. "But if we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it, and we need backup." By noon, we had assembled a small team. Henderson had called in 2 other officers, Johnson and Stevens, along with Frank Torres, a tribal ranger who knew the desert better than anyone. Torres brought supplies, industrial cable, motion sensors, and something else wrapped in rough cloth that he handled with obvious reverence. "Cedar ash and cornmeal," he explained when he saw my questioning look. "Old protection. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But out here it's better to be safe." His weathered face was grim. "My grandfather used to tell stories about things that came out of the deep places, things that wore familiar faces to trick people." We drove out to the mine in convoy, 2 patrol cars and my pickup truck kicking up dust clouds that hung in the still air. The landscape grew more desolate as we climbed into the foothills, the vegetation sparser, the silence more complete. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The mine entrance was a dark wound in the hillside, framed by rusted steel beams and posted with faded warnings about unstable conditions and toxic gases. The opening yawned like a mouth, and I could feel cold air flowing from its depths despite the heat of the day. Torres began laying out his protective circle while the others set up the trap. We strung cables across strategic points, positioned the motion sensors, and prepared the charges that would seal the entrance once the creature was inside. It was a desperate plan, full of variables we couldn't control, but it was all we had. I took Ranger's collar from my pocket, worn leather and jingling tags that I'd removed from around his neck the day I brought him home as a puppy. The metal was warm from my body heat, and for a moment I could almost smell his familiar doggy scent. My throat tightened as I hung it from a length of chain near the mine entrance, the tags chiming softly in the breeze. "It'll come," Torres said with quiet certainty. "Things like this, they're drawn to what they've touched, what they've taken." He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Your dog, the real one, he's gone. What's coming for us now is something else wearing his shape." We took positions among the rocks and scrub brush, each of us armed and connected by radio. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace, but I barely felt the heat. Every nerve was stretched tight. Every shadow might hide our quarry. The collar swayed gently in the breeze, its tags catching the light and sending tiny flashes across the hillside. Hours passed. Johnson reported movement twice, but both times it turned out to be nothing more than tumbleweeds blown by the wind. My water bottle emptied and Henderson passed me another. The taste was metallic, contaminated by the adrenaline that had been coursing through my system since the night before. "Contact." Stevens's voice crackled through the radio. "Something moving up the wash, maybe 200 yards out." I raised my binoculars and scanned the terrain. At first I saw nothing but heat, shimmer, and rock. Then movement caught my eye. A four-legged shape picking its way carefully between the boulders, staying in the shadows where possible. Even at this distance, I could see that something was wrong with its gait. It moved like an animal with broken bones that had healed incorrectly, all wrong angles and compensating lurches. "That's it," I whispered into my radio. The creature approached slowly, cautiously, as if it sensed the trap. It paused frequently to test the air, head swiveling back and forth with mechanical precision. When it reached the perimeter of Torres's protective circle, it stopped completely, hackles rising. For long minutes, it paced back and forth at the invisible barrier, occasionally reaching one paw forward only to snatch it back as if burned. Its frustration was obvious in every line of its distorted body. The whining started then, that horrible sound I remembered from the night before, but amplified and more desperate. "It can't cross the line," Torres murmured with satisfaction. "The old ways still have power." But even as he spoke, the creature was testing other approaches. It circled the mine entrance, always staying just outside the circle, looking for weaknesses. Its eyes, those horrible amber lights, never stopped moving, cataloging every detail of our trap. Then it began to change tactics. The whining shifted in pitch and tone, becoming more recognizably dog-like. It sat back on its haunches and tilted its head in a gesture so perfectly like Ranger that my heart clenched. When it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was a perfect imitation of my dog's bark. The same cadence, the same pitch, the same urgent quality he used when he wanted inside during a storm. "Don't listen," Henderson warned. "Don't let it get in your head." But it was too late. Despite everything I'd seen, despite knowing what this thing really was, part of my mind seized on that familiar sound. What if I'd been wrong? What if this really was Ranger, injured and confused, but still my loyal companion? What if the strange proportions were just tricks of shadow and distance? The creature seemed to sense my wavering resolve. It approached the circle's edge again, moving with exaggerated care, limping slightly as if hurt. Its whining took on a pleading quality that tore at my heart. When it looked directly at me across the distance, its eyes seemed less alien, more like the trusting gaze I remembered. "It's not him," Torres said firmly, as if reading my thoughts. "Whatever your dog was, this thing ate that up and is wearing what's left like a costume." The creature's performance continued for nearly an hour. It whimpered and pawed at the invisible barrier, its eyes never leaving me. Several times it seemed to give up, turning away and taking a few steps into the desert before circling back with renewed determination. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but I barely noticed the heat. "This isn't working," Johnson said over the radio. "We can't wait here forever." He was right. We were running out of daylight, and I could see storm clouds building on the horizon. Another sandstorm that would give the creature perfect cover to escape. We needed to force its hand. "I'm going to break the circle," I announced, starting to rise from my hiding place. "No!" Torres's voice was sharp with alarm. "That protection is the only thing keeping it from rushing us all at once." But I was already moving, picking my way down the slope toward the mine entrance. The creature's head snapped toward me immediately, its entire posture changing from pleading to predatory in an instant. The mask of canine confusion fell away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. As I approached the circle's edge, the thing began to pace faster, its movements becoming more agitated. The whining stopped, replaced by a low growling that raised every hair on my arms. When I reached the boundary marked by cedar ash and cornmeal, I hesitated. "Come on, boy," I called softly, using the same tone I'd always used with Ranger. "Come home." The creature's response was immediate and terrifying. It reared up on its hind legs, revealing its true size, nearly 7 feet tall when fully extended. Its forelegs, elongated and wrong, stretched toward me with desperate hunger. The face that had seemed so familiar from a distance was revealed in horrible detail. Muzzle stretched too long, jaw unhinged like a snake's, eyes that burned with an intelligence no animal should possess. It spoke then, in a voice that was almost human, but not quite. "Home," it said, the word mangled by its deformed mouth. Home. Hungry. Home. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This thing could talk. Whatever it was, wherever it had come from, it had absorbed more than just my dog's appearance. It had somehow consumed his memories, his understanding of human speech and emotion. "Now!" Henderson's voice cut through my shock. I dove to one side as the creature lunged forward, crossing the broken circle in a single bound. The motion sensors screamed their alerts as cables snapped taut, but the thing was too large, too strong. It tore through our carefully laid trap like tissue paper, focused entirely on reaching me. Behind it, I could see my teammates converging on the mine entrance, weapons drawn. But the creature ignored them completely. All its attention was fixed on me with laser intensity. It landed heavily, rolled, and came up running with that horrible fluid grace. I ran for the mine shaft, hoping to lead it into the trap. Behind me, I could hear its claws scrabbling on rock, its labored breathing that sounded too much like laughter. The entrance loomed ahead, a pool of absolute darkness that promised either salvation or doom. At the last second, I threw myself to one side. The creature, unable to stop its momentum, plunged into the mine shaft with a howl of rage that echoed from the depths. Torres was already at the detonator, his weathered hands steady on the trigger. "Fire in the hole!" he shouted. The explosion shook the entire hillside, sending up a cloud of dust and debris that blocked out the sun. When it cleared, the mine entrance was gone, sealed beneath tons of fallen rock. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. We stood in the settling dust, staring at the pile of rubble that had once been a mine entrance. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant rumble of approaching thunder. The storm clouds that had been building all afternoon were nearly overhead now, promising another night of wind and sand. "Is it over?" Johnson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Henderson approached the collapsed entrance, kicking at loose stones with the toe of his boot. "Hard to say. These old mines go deep, connect to each other underground. If that thing survived the blast..." He didn't finish the thought, but we all understood. The desert was riddled with abandoned shafts and forgotten tunnels. We might have sealed one entrance, but there were dozens of others scattered across the region. Torres began gathering up his supplies, carefully collecting the remaining cedar ash and cornmeal. "The protection won't last forever," he said grimly. "These old barriers, they need to be renewed, maintained. And that thing, it was smart. It learned from this encounter." As we packed up our equipment, I found myself staring at Ranger's collar, still hanging from its chain near what had been the mine entrance. The tags caught the last rays of sunlight, sending tiny rainbows across the rubble. I should have felt relief, or satisfaction, or something approaching closure. Instead, I felt hollow, scraped clean by the day's events. "We need to set up a monitoring system," Henderson said as we walked back to the vehicles. "Motion detectors, cameras, regular patrols. If there are more of these things..." "There are," Torres interrupted. "My grandfather's stories, they talked about whole packs of them. Things that came up from the deep places when the barriers got weak, when people forgot the old protections." He looked at each of us in turn. This was just one, and now it knows we're watching. The drive back to town was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The storm hit just as we reached the outskirts, turning day to night in minutes. Sand whipped across the road, reducing visibility to mere feet. I had to lean forward over the steering wheel, following the taillights of Henderson's patrol car like a lifeline. By the time I reached home, the storm was in full fury. My house looked small and vulnerable against the wall of wind and sand, windows glowing like eyes in the darkness. I sat in my truck for a long moment, engine running, reluctant to make the dash to my front door. When I finally made it inside, the house felt different. Not threatening exactly, but changed somehow, as if the events of the past 2 days had altered its very structure. I checked every window, every door, making sure the locks were secure. Then I scattered fresh cedar ash across all the thresholds, muttering a prayer my grandmother had taught me decades ago. The storm raged all night, rattling windows and shaking the walls. I didn't sleep, couldn't even close my eyes without seeing that horrible, elongated face, those burning amber eyes. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, cleaning my rifle and listening to the wind howl like voices calling from the deep desert. 3 weeks passed quietly. The sealed mine became a local landmark of sorts, marked with official hazard signs and unofficial warnings scratched into nearby rocks. Henderson increased patrols in the area, and Torres conducted regular inspections of his protective barriers. For a while, it seemed like our desperate plan had actually worked. I returned to my normal routine, teaching history to 7th graders, grading papers, trying to pretend that the world made sense again. But the desert had changed for me. What had once felt like home now seemed full of hidden threats, shadows that might conceal watching eyes, sounds that could be something more than wind through sagebrush. My students noticed the change. Where I had once been patient and encouraging, I became sharp-edged and easily startled. When Timothy Rodriguez asked about local Native American legends for his report, I found myself giving him a lecture about the dangers of disturbing things that should be left alone, my voice rising until the entire class was staring at me in silence. The first sign that our victory had been temporary came on a Tuesday evening. I was cooking dinner when I heard scratching at the back door. The same deliberate pattern that had started it all. My blood turned to ice as I set down my spatula and approached the window. Nothing there. Just wind and shadows. But when I checked the next morning, I found scratches in the wood around the doorframe. Fresh gouges that went deep into the timber, made by claws far larger than any dog possessed. The pattern was different this time, more aggressive, angrier. Whatever had made those marks was no longer content to simply ask for entry. I called Henderson immediately. Within an hour, he and Torres were at my house, examining the damage with grim expressions. "It found another way out," Torres said, running his fingers along the deepest gouges. "Or maybe there were more of them down there than we thought." "The mine's still sealed," Henderson reported after checking with the patrol that had driven by earlier. "No sign of disturbance. But that doesn't mean much if these things can travel underground." We spent the afternoon reinforcing my defenses. Fresh barriers went up around the entire property, stronger and more complex than the simple circle Torres had used at the mine. Motion-activated floodlights were installed, along with a direct radio link to the sheriff's department. By evening, my modest home looked like a fortress under siege. That night, I sat in my living room with all the lights on, rifle across my knees, waiting. The desert was unusually quiet. No coyotes calling, no rustle of small animals in the brush. Even the ever-present wind had died to nothing, leaving an oppressive silence that seemed to press against the windows. At exactly 3:17 a.m., every motion detector triggered at once. The floodlights blazed to life, turning my yard into a harsh landscape of light and shadow. But I saw nothing moving, no creature caught in the illumination, just empty desert stretching away into darkness. Then I heard breathing, not my own rapid, frightened gasps, but something else. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The sound moved around the house's perimeter, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always just beyond the reach of the lights. I keyed my radio with trembling fingers. "Henderson, it's here. On our way. Stay inside. Stay calm." But calm was impossible. The breathing was getting closer, and now I could hear something else mixed with it. A low humming sound, almost musical. It took me several terrified minutes to recognize it as a lullaby my grandmother used to sing, the melody perfectly reproduced, but emanating from a throat never meant for human songs. The humming stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard a new sound, the gentle tinkling of metal tags, like a dog collar, swaying in a breeze that didn't exist. Henderson and his backup arrived within minutes, but by then the creature had vanished again. We found tracks this time, not the familiar paw prints of a dog, but something else entirely. The impressions were roughly circular, about the size of a dinner plate, with marks around the edges that might have been claws or something worse. "These don't match anything in the wildlife identification guides," Henderson said, shining his flashlight on the clearest print. "And they're fresh, can't be more than an hour old." Torres knelt beside the tracks, studying them with the intense focus of a man reading a language older than words. When he finally looked up, his expression was troubled. "It's learning," he said quietly. "Adapting. The first time we saw it, it was still mostly wearing your dog's shape, trying to fool us with familiar forms. Now it's becoming something else, something new. We followed the trail as far as we could, but it disappeared at the edge of a rocky outcrop, where tracking became impossible. The prints led straight toward the foothills where the sealed mine lay hidden in darkness, but there were too many ways through the broken terrain to guess which path the creature had taken. Over the following days, more reports came in. Livestock found mutilated on ranches 50 miles away, pets disappearing from towns across 3 counties, sightings of strange animals that didn't match any known species. Each incident was slightly different, as if whatever we were dealing with was experimenting, testing new forms and behaviors. I stopped sleeping in my house entirely, taking refuge in a motel in town where the presence of other people provided some comfort. But even there, I felt watched. Shadows seemed to move wrong in my peripheral vision, and I caught myself checking the locks obsessively every few minutes. It was Torres who finally provided an explanation that made sense, even if it offered no comfort. "My grandfather called them the hungry ones," he said during one of our increasingly frequent strategy meetings. He said they came from the deep places when the world was young, before humans learned to protect themselves. They fed on life force, memory, identity, everything that makes a person who they are. He pulled out an old journal, its pages yellow with age and covered in careful handwriting. According to this, they could take the shape of anything they consumed, but they were never perfect copies. Always something wrong, something off about the proportions or behavior, and they were always hungry for more. "So when it took your dog," Henderson said, understanding dawning in his eyes, "it didn't just copy his appearance. It absorbed his memories, his connection to you. That's why it keeps coming back." I felt sick as the implications hit me. Ranger hadn't just been killed. He'd been consumed, dissolved into something alien and hostile. Everything that had made him unique, his personality and loyalty and love, had been digested and perverted into a tool for hunting. "Is there a way to stop them permanently?" I asked. Torres was quiet for a long moment, reading from his grandfather's journal. "The old stories say they can be destroyed, but not easily. They have to be separated from whatever identity they've stolen, forced back into their original form. And then..." He trailed off, his finger tracing lines of faded text. "And then what?" "Fire," he said simply. "The cleansing kind, hot enough to burn away memory itself. But first you have to trap them when they're vulnerable, when they're between shapes." He looked up at me with eyes full of regret. "It means using yourself as bait. Again." The plan we developed was simpler and more dangerous than our first attempt. No elaborate traps or technological solutions, just me, alone in the desert, carrying the one thing the creature wanted more than anything else. My own life, connected as it was to memories of the dog it had consumed. As the sun set on what might be my last day, I drove out to a flat stretch of desert far from any shelter or hiding place. just sand and sagebrush under an endless sky, with nowhere for either predator or prey to hide. I parked my truck in the center of the clearing, left the engine running, and stepped out into the cooling air. The creature came at full dark, just as we'd known it would. But this time it made no attempt at deception or stealth. It approached at a steady lope across the sand, its true form finally revealed in the light of my headlights. It was perhaps 8 feet long and half that tall, built like no animal that had ever walked the earth. Its skin was smooth and pale, almost translucent, revealing the dark network of veins beneath. The head was elongated and eyeless, ending in a mouth that split open along impossible angles to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. Where legs should have been, it had appendages that shifted and flowed like liquid, adapting to terrain and movement with horrible efficiency. But as it drew closer, I could see it changing. The smooth skin roughened and sprouted fur. The flowing appendages solidified into recognizable legs. The blank head reshaped itself, growing ears and eyes and a familiar snout. By the time it stopped 20 feet away from me, it wore Ranger's form again. Not perfect, but close enough to break my heart. "Home," it said in that horrible almost voice. "Hungry. Home." I raised the gasoline can I'd brought and began splashing fuel in a wide circle around myself. The creature watched with intelligent eyes, understanding the threat but unable to resist the lure of my presence. "You want what I remember about him?" I called out. "All those years of love and loyalty and trust. But those memories don't belong to you." The thing that wore my dog's face tilted its head, a gesture so perfectly Ranger-like that tears sprang to my eyes. Then it began to approach, crossing the line of gasoline without hesitation. I struck the match and dropped it. The ring of fire blazed up instantly, trapping us both in a circle of flame. The creature shrieked. Not with Ranger's voice now, but with something far older and more alien. Its stolen form began to dissolve, revealing the pale horror beneath as it thrashed against the barriers of fire. In the end, it took less than a minute. The thing that had worn my dog's identity crumbled to ash, taking with it all the stolen memories and perverted love it had consumed. When the flames finally died, nothing remained but a circle of scorched earth, and the fading echo of something that might have been a grateful whine. I knelt in the cooling sand and wept for my dog, truly gone now, but finally at peace. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Just a normal desert song, wild and free and exactly as it should be. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient lights in a sky that suddenly felt like home again. I gathered up the ashes and scattered them to the wind, watching them disappear into the vast darkness of the desert night. Some hungers, I had learned, could only be satisfied by complete destruction. But in that destruction there could also be a kind of peace, for the hunter, for the hunted, and for those who loved them both. My name is Ethan Cole, and I've been a park ranger for the past 15 years. It's not an easy job, but it's one I was drawn to ever since I was a kid growing up in the suburbs of Detroit. I loved being outdoors, going camping and hiking with my family in the dense forests of northern Michigan. There was something about the silence, the towering pines, the earthy smells, and the endless expanse of nature that called to me. After high school, I studied forestry at Michigan State University. Park ranger jobs were competitive, but I was determined. I applied everywhere I could: Oregon, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina. I was thrilled when I finally landed a position at a remote national forest in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The pay wasn't great, but I didn't become a ranger for the money. I took the job for the solitude, the beauty, and the chance to help others experience the wonders of nature. Still, it was tough making ends meet sometimes, especially with student loans. I lived simply in a small cabin the park provided, I quickly learned that being a ranger was more than just leisurely hikes in the woods. I dealt with everything from forest fires to search and rescue missions for lost hikers. You never knew what each day would bring. But I loved the work, despite the dangers and difficulties. There was only one other ranger assigned to my district, an old-timer named Jack. He'd been there for decades and knew the forest like the back of his hand. Jack was a quiet man, content with his own company. But around the campfire at night, he'd sometimes tell stories passed down about the woods, old folklore and legends. I didn't put much stock in Jack's tales at first, but soon I'd learn there was more truth in them than I ever imagined. It was a crisp fall morning when I set out on patrol, the sun barely peeking above the pine-covered hills. Fallen leaves crunched under my boots as I hiked along a trail on the far outskirts of the park. It was archery deer season, so I was checking that the hunters were staying within the designated areas. About 2 miles in, I smelled the unmistakable scent of a campfire. Strange, as this was a remote spot far from the main campgrounds, and no camping permits had been issued for this area. I followed my nose off the trail and came upon a small tent nestled in a grove of oaks along the river. "Hello, Ranger Service," I called out as I approached the illegal campsite. No response. I unzipped the tent and poked my head in. Empty, though it looked like whoever was staying there had left in a hurry. Sleeping bag tossed aside, belongings scattered. A sudden snap of branches behind me made me spin around. About 20 yards away, just behind a large birch tree, I glimpsed a figure. The outline of a man, watching me. He was too far for me to make out details, but something about his posture, his intensity, made my stomach clench. "Sir, this is a restricted area," I shouted, trying to keep my voice stern and steady. "I need you to come out and talk to me." The man didn't move, didn't blink. He just kept staring with a disturbing stillness. Slowly, I rested my hand on the utility belt that held my radio, prepared to call for backup. But in the split second I glanced down, the man vanished. It was like he melted into the forest without a trace. An uneasy feeling crept over me as I scanning the trees. Something was off. I hurried to pack up the illegal camp, wanting to get out of there as soon as possible to report the incident. But I couldn't shake the unsettling sensation of eyes on me. It was only later that I recalled one of Jack's tales about sightings over the years of a mysterious figure lurking in this very stretch of woods. The stories varied. Some claimed he was the vengeful spirit of a fur trapper who froze to death in the 1800s. Others described him as something not quite human. I'd always laughed them off as backwoods superstition and overactive imaginations. Now I wasn't so sure. But I kept my strange encounter to myself, not wanting to be ridiculed. If only I knew then that this was just the beginning, that I'd soon be pulled into a nightmare of folklore come to life. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I'd seen in the woods that day. I was a rational man, not prone to flights of fancy or paranormal beliefs. There had to be a logical explanation, like a transient camping illegally. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, my unease grew. Strange things started happening in the forest. Trees that looked like they'd been clawed by enormous talons. Horrific guttural sounds echoing through the night that didn't belong to any animal I knew of. A putrid stench around the area where I'd seen the man, like rotting flesh, that came and went without explanation. I started asking Jack more about the local folklore. He seemed almost reluctant to talk about it at first. "Look, kid, there's things in these woods that have been here a lot longer than you or I," he said cryptically. "Things that don't follow nature's rules. You're better off staying clear of it all." But the more I pressed, the more Jack shared tales passed down through generations about dark entities inhabiting the forest. Spirits of the lost and damned. Creatures that were once human but transformed into something wicked. Demons that could possess animals and people. "What about the man I saw?" I asked hesitantly. "Could he be one of these beings?" "Aye, he could," Jack said, staring into the campfire. Fits the description of a malevolent spirit some call the Watchman. Story goes he was a logger back in the pioneer days. Got lost in a blizzard and was possessed by evil as his body froze. Now he wanders, seeking vengeance on the living who dare to cross his path. A chill ran through me despite the heat of the flames. I wanted to dismiss it all as myth, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the precipice of something beyond my grasp. Something ancient and sinister. That night, I dreamt of red eyes peering from darkness, gnarled branches that reached out like skeletal hands, and a suffocating, inescapable dread. I woke in a cold sweat with the phantom sensation of icy breath on my neck. Deep down, I knew the Watchman was real, and that he had his sights set on me. I tried to throw myself into my normal ranger duties, hoping that the routines of trail maintenance and permit checks would keep my mind off the growing paranormal strangeness. But it was like the dark forces at work sensed my awareness. Activity in the forest escalated with each passing day. Hikers reported hearing whispers and feeling ominous presences stalking them. A boy from a camping family went missing for a full day before being found huddled in a ravine miles from their site, shaking and incoherent. Wildlife cameras captured fleeting images of twisted, shadowy shapes lurking in the trees. I responded to an unnerving number of calls about missing persons and disturbances in the woods. Each incident was near the remote area where I first encountered the mysterious figure, and every time I had to venture into that stretch of forest, I felt the heavy, malignant energy raising the hairs on the back of my neck. It all reached a breaking point when I discovered the dead, mutilated deer. I was hiking near the river on a foggy morning, dawn light struggling to penetrate the mist, when I noticed a red trail marring the undergrowth. With a sense of grim foreboding, I followed it to a small clearing. The buck had been torn apart and strewn across the forest floor, organs spilled from its cavity, legs at unnatural angles. The carnage was far too savage to be from a normal predator, but the worst part was the symbol carved into the trees surrounding it, a jagged rune dripping sap like blood. I recognized it from one of Jack's books. It represented the Watchman's mark. That was when I knew for certain that the evil of folklore had taken hold in the forest and targeted me. My rational world was crumbling as my nightmares seeped into reality. I radioed Jack with a shaky voice, moving as fast as I could out of those cursed woods. Even as I fled, I felt the Watchman's presence dogging my steps, heard his grating laughter on the wind. I knew I was being dragged into something I didn't understand, some primal darkness that threatened to consume me. Panting, heart pounding, I burst from the tree line and leaned against my truck. But there was no relief as I looked down and saw words gouged into my arm, weeping blood. "You're mine now." After the horror of finding the Watchman's mark carved into my flesh, I couldn't keep this supernatural darkness to myself anymore. I spilled everything to Jack, all that I'd experienced since that first fateful encounter. To my surprise, he didn't seem shocked by my tale. If anything, he looked almost resigned, like he'd been dreading this day. "The Watchman's chosen you, kid," he said grimly. "Once he sets his sights on a victim, he doesn't relent until he claims them." Jack revealed that he'd had his own run-ins with the evil spirit over his long years as a ranger. He'd lost friends and colleagues to the Watchman's malevolence, seen good men driven to madness or worse. The old ranger had been spared only because he'd learned to abide by certain rules, leave offerings of blood at the clearing by the river, never use the Watchman's name, avoid his territory unless absolutely necessary. "Is there no way to fight him?" I asked desperately, absently tracing the scabbed cuts on my arm. "Not that I've found," Jack sighed. "Best we can do is try to appease him, stay out of his way. We're no match for a vengeful demon." But I couldn't accept that. Couldn't resign myself to living under the thumb of this reign of terror. Over the next weeks, as the paranormal activity escalated to a fever pitch, I scoured Jack's folklore books for any scrap of information about the Watchman's origins and how to defeat him. I learned that he'd been a brutal man in life, a mercenary who tortured and killed with impunity. It was said he'd made a deal with dark forces for power, and that pact held even after death. The watchman was tied to the deep, ancient parts of the forest, drawing strength from the ley lines and forgotten burial grounds hidden beneath the roots. As I dug deeper into the dark mythology of the land, I felt myself slipping further into the watchman's world. My dreams were plagued by visions of his life and the depraved acts that had blackened his soul. Waking and sleeping bled together until I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I was deteriorating physically and mentally, pushing myself to the brink of exhaustion as I searched for a way out. The watchman's influence sank its claws into my mind, my blood, my very being. I knew I was losing myself to his insidious power. But just when all hope seemed lost, I stumbled across an account of the one time the watchman had been thwarted, when pioneers had rallied together to perform an ancient ritual of banishment. It was a desperate, dangerous long shot, but it was my only chance. I had to confront the demon that had marked me and pray that I was strong enough to free myself from his grasp, even if it cost me everything. The old journal detailed a ritual that had to be performed in the heart of the watchman's territory on the night of the winter solstice, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. It required objects imbued with power, grave dirt from a holy man, water from a sacred spring, the ashes of a yew tree struck by lightning. I threw myself into gathering the arcane items, growing more gaunt and feverish with each passing day. The watchman seemed to sense my intent. He plagued my every step, sending his dark manifestations to torment me. I glimpsed his form flickering in mirrors, heard his rasping whispers in silence. But I pressed on, determined to see this through. Jack pleaded with me to abandon my efforts, saying I was only putting myself in more danger, that the watchman would make me suffer for my defiance. Deep down, I knew he was right, but I couldn't turn back now. I'd already sacrificed too much to this obsession. The solstice arrived in a swirl of snow and biting wind. I hiked to the clearing by the river where I first encountered the watchman, each step heavier with dread. The forest was deathly silent, every creature sensing the crackling energy in the air. At the stroke of midnight, I began the ritual, my chanted words ringing with desperate power. I poured the grave dirt in a circle around me, sprinkled the yew ashes, anointed my body with the holy water. The watchman's roar of fury shook the trees as freezing gusts tore at my flesh. Through the blizzard he came for me, eyes blazing like hellfire in the ghoulish face of a rotted corpse. I felt his rage beating against the flimsy protection of the ritual circle, felt my strength, my sanity, my soul bending under his assault. Still I chanted the words that would bind him, ignoring the blood that streamed from my eyes and nose, the searing agony that ripped through my body. For a moment, I believed I could banish him, cast out the evil that had stalked me for so long. But with a bone-shaking boom, the watchman shattered the circle. The force of the blast knocked me back against a tree, skull connecting with a crack. As my vision flickered and darkened, I saw him looming over me, a triumphant sneer twisting his grotesque features. "Foolish boy," the demon growled, in a voice like the grating of tombstones. "Did you really think your pitiful magic could defeat me? I've waited lifetimes to claim you, and now you're mine for eternity." The watchman's decaying hand closed around my throat as oblivion dragged me under. My last thought was that I'd failed, and unleashed something unspeakable. I awoke to the metallic tang of blood and damp earth filling my nostrils. In the wavering lantern light, I saw that I was lying on the floor of some rough-hewn tunnel, cloying soil packed under my fingernails. My head throbbed, and my body felt shattered, barely able to move. But worse was the sense of visceral wrongness that coiled in my stomach. Memories filtered back in disorienting shards. The ritual, the watchman overpowering me, his grating voice growling threats. But there was more, so much more that I couldn't grasp. that skittered away when I tried to seize it, leaving only a residue of horror. I managed to turn my head, choking back bile at what I saw. Piles of bones in various states of decay littered the floor. Rib cages, femurs, sunken skulls with scraps of leathery flesh still clinging to them, and among the human remains, antlers. The watchman's victims, left to rot in this macabre lair. It was then I noticed what I was wearing: tattered flannel, threadbare denim, clothes that weren't my ranger uniform. Realization crashed over me like an icy deluge. I had no idea how much time had passed since the ritual. Days, weeks, months. It was all a terrifying blank. What had the watchman done to me in the lost time? What atrocities had I committed under his control? Before I could process the enormity of my predicament, I sensed a malevolent presence stirring in the shadows. The watchman emerged, a twisted grin stretching across his desiccated face. "Welcome home," he rasped. "I've waited a long time for a worthy vessel. And you, with your connection to the forest and your delicious despair, are perfect." With dawning revulsion, I understood. The watchman hadn't just captured me, he'd possessed me. In the hazy memories I could grasp, I saw my body carrying out his dark bidding, stalking hikers, performing blood sacrifices, spreading his evil influence. He'd hollowed me out and poured himself in, claiming my form as his own. The watchman grabbed me with preternatural strength, hauling me up to meet his burning gaze. "Now you're going to help me extend my domain," he hissed, "starting with those fools at the ranger station who fancy themselves guardians of this land." Even through the haze of possession, through the foreign evil infesting every cell, a small, stubborn part of me rebelled. I couldn't let the watchman use me to slaughter innocent people, to spread his corruption. I had to fight, had to find a way to wrest back control before it was too late. Gritting my teeth against the watchman's crushing dominance, I staggered drunkenly to my feet. "No," I growled, my voice rough with disuse and defiance. "I won't be your puppet. I won't let you win." The demon's surprise quickly morphed into cruel amusement. "Still trying to resist, are you? How precious. But you can't win against me, boy. I'm ancient and eternal, and no mortal can stand against my power." He slammed me against the earthen wall with brutal force, fingers digging into my throat. I choked and gasped as black spots swam in my vision. But in that moment, as I teetered on the edge of consciousness, I caught a gleam of silver in the corner of my eye. My ranger badge, half buried in the moldering piles of the watchman's lair. And I remembered what that badge represented: my sworn duty to protect the forest and all who entered it from harm. I thought of Jack and the other rangers who fought daily to keep the balance. I thought of all the lives the watchman had destroyed and would destroy if I surrendered. I couldn't let their sacrifices, my own sacrifices, be in vain. With a wordless cry, I lashed out, catching the watchman off guard. We grappled in a tangle of thrashing limbs, slamming into rock and bone, neither fully human anymore. The watchman's rotted fingers raked bloody furrows in my flesh, his fetid breath choking me. But I had a lifetime of training and a soul-deep determination on my side. I seized a fallen ranger's battered cross from the detritus and pressed it to the watchman's clammy skin. The demon shrieked as the silver seared him, his form flickering between corpus and shadow. "By my blood and bone, I cast you out," I bellowed, invoking the ritual's power with my last ounce of strength. "Leave this vessel and be banished to wander, powerless and impotent." The watchman's outraged howls reverberated through the cavern as a shock wave of energy exploded outward. I felt his scorching essence rip its way out of my body, leaving me flayed and breathless on the blood-slick ground. The world went white, then black. When I came to, I was alone in the watchman's lair, truly alone for the first time in months. His presence had been scoured from my mind, my flesh, leaving only tattered remnants behind. But I was free. Broken and scarred and half mad, but my own man once more. I limped my way out of that forsaken hole and back into the clean, snow-bright forest. each breath a victory. I knew I could never truly go back to my old life. Not after all I'd endured and all I'd done in the watchman's thrall. But I could carry on the fight, armed with the knowledge of how to defeat him. Because the watchman was still out there, weakened but not destroyed. Hunting for a new victim, a new skin to wear. And there would always need to be someone to stand against him, to protect the people and the land from the ancient evils that lurked in the dark places. That duty was mine now, my burden and my purpose. Until the day I drew my last breath, I would be the watcher in the woods, the guardian against the monsters of folklore and shadow. For I had beaten the demon and become something more than human in the process. My name is Ethan Novak. I'm 32 years old, and I live in a small cabin nestled in the remote wilderness of Oregon's Umpqua National Forest, where I work as a park ranger. It's a solitary life, patrolling these dense woods, but I've always been drawn to nature. Hiking, camping, exploring the backcountry. It's in my blood. I took this job for many reasons. After struggling to make ends meet waiting tables and working odd jobs, the steady paycheck of a park ranger was appealing. I was also desperate to escape my dead-end life in Portland and lose myself in the isolation of the forest. Out here, my mounting debts and aimless existence fade into the background, replaced by towering evergreens and rugged terrain that stretch as far as the eye can see. But mostly, I became a ranger because of my deep reverence for these wilderness areas. Places like the Umpqua are sanctuaries, some of the last remaining swaths of untouched land in an increasingly developed world. I've worked in parks and forests across the country, from the waterfalls of Michigan's Upper Peninsula to the rolling hills of Pennsylvania and the Appalachian peaks of North Carolina. Each is unique, but they all fill me with the same sense of awe, rendering me just a small speck in a vast, ancient tapestry. Out here in Western Oregon, I'm the sole ranger responsible for overseeing nearly 50,000 acres of remote backcountry. Cell service is non-existent, and my radio crackles with static more often than dispatches. My days are spent clearing brush from trails, doing maintenance on the seldom-used campground nearby, and watching for signs of the area's abundant wildlife: Roosevelt elk, black bear, mountain lions. It's not uncommon for hikers to get turned around on the faint, inconsistently marked trails. Usually they wander back to the trailhead on their own. But when they don't, I'm the one called in for search and rescue missions, heading out solo to scour the dense understory and rocky ravines. I've always had a knack for navigation, an innate sense of direction that borders on supernatural. I can't explain it, but out here, I feel a deep connection to the land, as if the forest itself is guiding me. Most of the time, I find the lost hikers within a day, frightened and vulnerable, but otherwise unharmed. But every so often, the situations are more dire. Like the young couple from Portland who disappeared 2 summers ago, leaving behind a tent and backpacks, never to be seen again. Or the elderly man who vanished last fall after wandering off trail to relieve himself. We only found bone fragments and tattered flannel, as if he'd been ripped apart by a hulking predator. The locals whisper about dark things in these woods, sinister creatures and malevolent forces that lurk in the shadows. They say people go missing every year, more than can be explained by accidents and natural causes alone. Loggers tell stories of blood-curdling howls echoing through the night, punctuated by shrill, almost human screams. Hunters stumble across strange stone cairns arranged in perfect circles, almost like ritual sites. Some even claim to have seen unexplainable creatures shambling through the trees, not quite animal but not fully human either. Of course, I've always dismissed such tales as nothing more than folklore and overactive imaginations. Ghost stories told around the campfire, the product of isolation and too much time spent in the woods. Even after a year spent living in the Umpqua, I've never seen anything that can't be explained by natural causes. At least I hadn't. Not until last week, when everything changed. The morning began like any other, with me setting off at first light to hike a series of trails near the confluence of Tallow Creek and the Umpqua River. Mist curled up from the mossy forest floor as dawn gradually brightened the canopy, transforming the world from shades of gray into lush green and gold. I was a few miles in, enjoying the chirps and trills of songbirds, when a faint rustling in the underbrush made me pause. Something was moving through the trees just out of sight, branches snapping and leaves crunching under what sounded like the tread of a very large animal. At first I thought it must be an elk or bear, but something about the noise unnerved me, sending a shiver cascading down my spine. Heart pounding, I called out a tentative greeting. "Hello? Is someone there?" The rustling stopped abruptly, plunging the forest into eerie silence. Even the birdsong had ceased. I stood frozen, straining to hear something, anything. But the woods had fallen still, as if collectively holding its breath. Uneasiness rising in my gut, I moved off trail to investigate. I'd barely taken 2 steps into the dense understory when the snapping of twigs erupted again, this time so close that it made me flinch. There was no mistaking it now. Something very large was moving through the brush mere yards away, just beyond my field of vision. "I'm a park ranger," I called, trying to keep my voice level. "I'm here to help if you're lost or injured." A guttural sound answered me, a low, rasping rattle that sounded unlike anything I'd ever heard before. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as a wave of primal fear washed over me. Whatever was in those trees, it was no elk or bear. It sounded wrong, unnatural. I backed away slowly, feeling my boots catch on gnarled roots and rocks. The thing in the brush let out another chilling sound, almost like a growl, and I could hear it start to move, circling around to block my path back to the trail. Seized by full-blown panic, I turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, heedless of the branches that whipped across my face and snagged at my clothes. Behind me, heavy footfalls gave chase, snapping saplings and flattening vegetation under the bulk of an immense body. An otherworldly howl reverberated through the forest, and I ran faster, lungs burning and side aching as I crashed through the underbrush with the single-minded desperation of prey fleeing a predator. I'm not sure how long or how far I ran. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling out onto a dirt logging road, gasping for breath, a stitch searing my side. Sweat poured down my face despite the morning chill as I braced my hands on my knees and fought to slow my racing heart. The road was blessedly deserted. No sign of whatever had pursued me out of the tree line. Sucking in deep breaths, I started the long walk back to my truck parked at the trailhead, glancing repeatedly over my shoulder. By the time I made it back, I'd almost managed to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe it had just been a particularly aggressive bear protecting its territory. But I couldn't quite shake the uncanny, skin-crawling feeling that I'd just escaped something far darker, something that belonged more in stories and nightmares than in the waking world. I had been running from a legend. I just didn't realize it at the time. A legend with sharper teeth and more malice than I could have ever imagined. Unable to stop thinking about what I'd experienced in the woods, I found myself driving down to the ranger station later that same day. I told myself that I just needed some human interaction after the morning's fright. But in truth, I wanted to know if anyone else had encountered anything strange in that area of the forest lately. The station was always quiet this time of year, with only a couple other rangers on duty. Hank, an older gentleman with a salt and pepper beard, was working the front desk when I arrived. He glanced up and chuckled when he saw me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Ethan, you look like you've seen a ghost. Rough day out there?" I mustered a weak smile as I approached the counter. "Something like that." "Hey, have there been any reports of animal sightings or activity near the Tallow Creek confluence? Anything out of the ordinary?" Hank pursed his lips thoughtfully. "Not that I can recall. Plenty of the usual. Elk, bear, cougar. But nothing unusual. Why do you ask?" I hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. What was I supposed to say? That I got spooked by a weird noise in the woods and ran for my life from what was likely just a curious animal? No reason, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. I just thought I saw something strange out there this morning. Probably just a trick of the light. Hank nodded, but his gaze had sharpened, studying my face intently. What did it look like, this strange thing you saw? I opened my mouth to brush off the question, but something in Hank's expression made me pause. There was a knowing glint in his eye, a hint of something deeper than mere curiosity. Almost as if he'd been waiting for someone to ask about strange sightings in these woods. I didn't actually see anything, I admitted. But I heard something. It sounded big. Too big to be any animal I've ever encountered out here. And the noises it made, they didn't sound natural. It was like a growl, but deeper, guttural, almost human-like. Hank's face had gone carefully blank, but I could see a flicker of unease in his eyes. He glanced around as if to make sure we were alone before leaning across the counter conspiratorially. "Listen, Ethan," he said, lowering his voice. "You're not the first person to say they've experienced something strange in those woods. Rangers and loggers have been telling stories for years. Stories of creatures that walk like men but aren't quite human. Things that lurk in the shadows, always just out of sight." I felt a tingle run down my arms, the fine hairs standing on end. "What kind of creatures?" Hank shook his head. "No one knows for sure. Some say they're spirits of the forest, guardians of the land. Others think they might be some undiscovered species of primate, like Bigfoot. And a few..." He trailed off, looking uncertain. "A few what?" I prompted. "A few believe there's something much older and darker. Something unnatural. Not of this world." Hank's voice had dropped to a whisper, his eyes haunted. "They say these woods are cursed, Ethan. That people who spend too much time out there alone start to change. They see and hear things they shouldn't. And sometimes they disappear entirely. Like they've been taken." A heavy silence descended over the station as Hank's words hung in the air. I could feel a cold sweat beating on my temple, a deep, instinctive dread settling into my bones. I'd always scoffed at the local legends and campfire tales, dismissing them as superstitious nonsense. But now, in the light of my own unsettling experience, I couldn't help but wonder if there might be some truth to the stories after all. "Has anyone ever found out what happens to the people who go missing?" I asked, my mouth dry. Hank let out a humorless chuckle. "Not a living soul, no. Oh, we've found remains from time to time. Bones picked clean, clothes rotting on the forest floor. But never enough to determine a cause of death. It's like they were just, erased, consumed by something lurking in the trees." He must have seen the fear in my eyes because he reached out to pat my arm bracingly. "Listen, Ethan, you've got good instincts. You're sharp, and you know these woods. But take my advice. Be careful out there. Don't go poking around in matters best left alone. There are some mysteries in this forest that mankind was never meant to unravel." I nodded mutely, my mind awhirl with dark thoughts and half-formed fears. As I left the station and stepped back out into the gathering dusk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stumbled onto something far more sinister than I could have imagined. A primordial darkness that slumbered in the ancient heart of the forest, waiting for the unwary to wander too far from the path. The creature I'd encountered that morning was only the beginning, a herald of the nightmare to come. I see that now. But at the time, I had no inkling of the true horror lying in wait, biding its time until it could draw me into its malevolent embrace. The next few days passed without incident, but the strange encounter remained firmly lodged in my mind. I went about my duties, maintaining trails, cleaning up campsites, watching for signs of wildlife, with a constant prickle between my shoulder blades, an unshakable feeling of being watched. The forest that had once brought me such peace now felt ominous, charged with a brooding menace. The sigh of wind through pines sounded like whispering voices, the snap of a twig underfoot enough to make my heart lurch into my throat. I caught myself scanning the trees as I hiked, searching for any sign of the creature or that eerily human footprint. Deep down, I knew I should leave it alone. Heed Hank's warning not to go poking at mysteries best left undisturbed. But my mind wouldn't rest, fixating on the sparse, chilling details. Missing hikers, unnatural beasts, stories of an ancient evil that haunted the woods. I felt like I'd brushed against something dark and primal, and now I couldn't turn away, even if I wanted to. A strange compulsion took hold of me, a visceral need to understand what I had experienced. I started spending my evenings huddled in my cabin, scouring archived reports and yellowing newspaper clippings for any mention of the Umpqua's dark legends. There was frustratingly little concrete information to go on, most of the stories couched in rumor and hearsay. But patterns began to emerge the deeper I delved. Disappearances stretching back decades, unexplained sightings, grisly remains found in the forest. The same tales surfaced again and again. Enormous footprints, eerie howls, faces glimpsed in the trees that seemed not quite human nor animal. The locals had many names for the creatures said to roam the Umpqua's shadowed valleys and mist-shrouded peaks. Skookum, Siatik, Quiquiai, Steyama. But one moniker in particular seized my attention: the Watchers in the Woods. According to the old stories, the Watchers were ancient beings, forest spirits that guarded their sacred territories with fierce devotion. Some accounts describe them as tricksters, forever luring the wayward traveler off trail. Others painted them as savage predators, hunting down the young and vulnerable. But all agreed on one unsettling detail: the Watchers could take human form, blending into their surroundings like wind through leaves, all the better to stalk their prey. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this was no mere legend. Something was out there in the forest, something old and dark and hungering. And with dawning horror, I realized I had caught its attention, crossed some invisible boundary into its domain. I was being watched by unfriendly eyes, tracked by a force that had lurked in these hills for generations. Sleep became elusive, my nights haunted by vivid nightmares. Yellow eyes glinting from the dark, gnarled hands snatching at my ankles, a guttural voice whispering my name over and over. I'd jolt awake in a cold sweat, certain that I could hear something rustling outside my cabin walls, circling, searching. The rational part of my mind insisted this was all just my imagination running wild, that the stories had burrowed into my subconscious and spawned night terrors. But deep down, in some primal reptilian corner of my brain, I knew the truth. The Watchers were real, and they had marked me as their next victim. I knew I should get out, put in for a transfer to a less remote posting. But I felt trapped, caught in a nightmarish loop from which there was no escape. Who would believe me, the crazy ranger raving about monsters in the woods? And more insidiously, a dark fascination had taken root, a perverse need to see this through, to understand the face of the evil that lurked in the forest I loved. It was that fascination that drove me from the safety of my cabin, late one moonless night. Unable to bear the suffocating confines any longer, I set off down the trail on shaking legs, armed with only a flashlight and my unreliable courage. If the Watchers wanted me, then let them come. I would meet my fate head-on, confront this primeval force that had haunted the Umpqua since before the first humans set foot in its vales. In retrospect, it was madness, a kind of sleep-deprived insanity born of isolation and the spore-like influence of the dark legends. At the time, it felt like the only choice, the inevitable conclusion of the path I'd stumbled onto. The Watchers were calling to me, and I was powerless to resist their summons. I stumbled through the darkened woods, my flashlight carving a feeble path through the pressing shadows. The forest was preternaturally still, not even a whisper of wind stirring the branches. It was as if the Watchers knew I was coming, and had stilled the wilderness itself in anticipation. Every snapped twig and rustle of underbrush made my heart slam against my ribs, convinced that the creatures were closing in. I kept swinging my flashlight beam in erratic arcs, trying to catch a glimpse of yellow eyes or gnarled limbs. But there was nothing, just an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow the light. I don't know how long I walked, or how far. Time lost all meaning in that eldritch gloom, minutes stretching into eternities. All I knew was the crunching of leaves underfoot and the thundering of blood in my ears. And then I saw it. Ahead, through a gap in the trees, a flicker of movement. Something large and bipedal, shambling between the trunks with an uncanny, loping gait. I froze, my breath turning to ice in my lungs. The figure paused at the edge of my flashlight's reach, half shrouded in shadow. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong. Limbs too long, and posture hunched and feral. As I watched in mute horror, it turned its head in my direction. Eyes glinted in the darkness, reflecting the light like twin mirrors. They were too large, too knowing, holding a feral intelligence that sent atavistic terror screaming down my spine. That gaze stripped me bare, peering into the depths of my soul and finding me desperately wanting. I took a faltering step back, a whimper building in my throat. The creature mirrored my movement, gliding forward with a predator's coiled grace. I could see more of it now, mottled skin stretched tight over jutting bone, a face that was a twisted mockery of human features. What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice thin and reedy with fear. The creature's mouth split into a leering grin, revealing rows of pointed teeth. When it spoke, its voice was a sibilant rasp, a guttural croak that sounded like no language of man. "Watcher," it hissed, the word hanging in the fetid air between us. "Guardian, hungry." It crept closer, unfolding to its full height. It towered over me, 8 feet of coiled menace and primal wrongness. I could smell it now, an overpowering musk of wet earth and rotting leaves and something metallic and cloying. I stumbled back blindly, but I could feel its presence all around me, suffocating. There was no escape, no fighting this primordial force that ruled the ancient wood. I had wandered foolishly into its domain, and now I would pay the price, another screaming set of bones to molder in the loam. The Watcher lunged, a blur of shaggy fur and jagged claws. I felt a line of icy fire across my chest, and then I was falling, tumbling backwards into a dense huckleberry thicket. Branches snapped and tore at my clothes as I rolled down a steep incline, coming to a bone-jarring halt against the trunk of a massive cedar. I lay there, winded and bleeding, certain that the creature would be on me in seconds. But there was only silence, a watchful stillness that was somehow more terrifying than any roar or howl. With a titanic effort, I pushed myself to my feet, swaying drunkenly. My flashlight beam danced wildly across the trees, revealing nothing but shadow and dense brush. No sign of the Watcher. And then I heard it. A low, ululating cry that echoed through the hills, rising and falling in eerie harmonics. It was taken up by another voice, and then another, until the night reverberated with that uncanny song, an undulating chorus of inhumanity. The meaning was clear. Ice water certainty crystallizing in my veins. There wasn't just one creature stalking these woods. There was a multitude, an entire clan of eldritch beings that had marked me as their quarry. I had stumbled into an ancient hunting ground, and now the Watchers were gathering, intent on running me to ground. Blind panic seized me, and I ran, crashing headlong through the suffocating trees. Branches whipped my face and tangling roots clutched at my ankles, but I barely felt them, driven by animal terror. That horrible baying dogged my steps, drawing closer with every desperate stride. I have no clear memory of my frenzied flight through the lightless wood. Only the impression of laboring lungs and heaving sides, the taste of blood and loam, a cacophony of snapping underbrush and eldritch howls. The creatures harried me like wolves, culling a weakened deer, nipping at my heels and flushing me time and again when I sought a moment's respite. All I knew was that I had to run. run until my heart burst and my bones shattered, because to stop was to die, torn to shreds by the nightmares made flesh that bayed at my back. It felt like a fever dream, a ceaseless, stumbling eternity. My world shrank down to the ragged pull of breath in my lungs, the burn of lactic acid, the hypnotic conviction that the darkness held only teeth and claws and a grisly end. On and on I fled, until the first pale fingers of dawn started to lift the night's veil. I remember staggering out onto a logging track, so drained of will and strength that I simply collapsed, hardly able to turn my head to see if death was still at my heels. But the watcher's cries had faded with the rising sun, that eldritch chorus slinking back into shadow. Now, huddled in my cabin with every window and door barred, I can only pray that the daylight will keep the beasts at bay. But I know the truth, marrow deep. The watchers are still out there, patient and eternal, hungering for another taste of their sport. Come nightfall, the hunt will resume. And this time, I don't think I have the strength to outrun the horrors in the dark. The day passed in a haze of exhaustion and dread, the hours crawling by with excruciating slowness. I huddled in the meager safety of my cabin, jumping at every creak of settling timbers, every rustle of wind through the eaves. My wounds throbbed mercilessly, jagged claw marks oozing blood and clear fluid, the flesh around them hot and tight with infection. I knew I needed medical attention, knew that blood poisoning was a very real threat. But the thought of venturing out, of exposing myself to the horrors that lurked in the forest, was unbearable. I was trapped, as surely as if the watchers had me cornered in some lightless den. As the sun began its inevitable descent, painting the sky in lurid shades of orange and red, the reality of my situation crashed over me in a frigid wave. I couldn't stay here, cowering and waiting for the creatures to come for me. I had to get out, had to find help before sepsis or the watchers claimed me. With shaking hands, I gathered what meager supplies I could. A first aid kit, a few energy bars, a battered compass. I paused over the gun safe, fingers trembling on the combination lock. I'd never been comfortable with firearms, but the thought of facing the watchers unarmed made my gorge rise. In the end, I left the guns untouched. What good would they do against creatures that had haunted these woods since time immemorial? That had evaded detection and capture for generations? No. If I was to have any chance of survival, it would be through stealth and cunning, not brute force. I waited until the last sliver of sun had vanished behind the hills, until the gloom of twilight had settled thick and heavy over the forest. Then, with a whispered prayer to whatever gods might be listening, I slipped out into the gathering dark. The night closed around me like a suffocating shroud, full of unseen menace. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made my heart lurch into my throat. I was painfully aware of how loud my breathing sounded, how the scent of my terror must hang in the air like a beacon. I had a vague plan, formulated through the fog of pain and exhaustion. I would make my way to the ranger station, try to radio for help. It was a good 15 miles through dense forest, a journey that would have been challenging even in peak condition. In my current state, it felt like an impossible odyssey, a fool's errand. But what choice did I have? To stay in my cabin was certain death, either from my festering wounds or the watcher's cruel claws. At least this way, I had a chance, however slim. I set off at a stumbling jog, trying to balance the need for haste with the imperative of stealth. The forest was a maze of shadow and lumpen silhouettes, eerie and changed from the sunlit woods I knew. Every gnarled trunk and reaching branch seemed to conceal watching eyes, grasping hands. I hadn't gone more than a mile before I heard it. That low, ululating cry that froze the blood in my veins. It echoed through the hills, a primal song of hunger and anticipated violence. Moments later, an answering chorus rose from the depths of the forest, that eerie, undulating harmony that signaled the watcher's hunt. Panic seized me in an icy fist and I ran, abandoning all pretense of subtlety. I crashed through the undergrowth, heedless of the noise I was making, knowing that the creatures had already caught my scent. My only hope was to outpace them, to somehow stay one desperate step ahead of those implacable pursuers. The night came alive with the sounds of the hunt, rustling brush, snapping branches, the excited yips and snarls of the watchers as they closed in. I could feel their presence all around me, a suffocating miasma of malice and predatory glee. They were toying with me, herding me deeper into the woodland, farther from any hope of aid. Time lost all meaning, narrowing down to the burn of air in my lungs, the leaden weight of my limbs, the hypnotic conviction that the darkness held only a swift and bloody end. I ran until I could run no more, until my foot caught on a protruding root and I went sprawling, fetching up hard against a downed tree. I lay there, winded and spent, listening to the eager rustles and snarls of my pursuers as they closed in. This was it then, the terminus of my ill-conceived flight. Here, in the depths of the ancient forest, far from any human comfort or succor, I would meet my end, savaged by the horrors that lurked in the dark. The watchers emerged from the trees, yellow eyes gleaming with feral intelligence. They stalked closer, lips peeling back from jagged teeth in anticipatory snarls. I could smell their musk, that overwhelming feeder of wet earth and decay and blood hunger. I scrabbled backwards frantically, feeling my hand close on a length of sturdy branch. A desperate plan crystallized in my mind, born of the clarity that only comes when staring into the jaws of certain death. I lurched to my feet, makeshift club held before me like a talisman. "Come on then, you bastards," I snarled, surprised at the steel in my own voice. "Come and get me." The watchers lunged as one, a tide of gnashing teeth and scything claws. With strength born of desperation, I brought my club around in a whistling arc, feeling it connect with a satisfying crunch of bone. One of the creatures yelped and fell back, greenish ichor sluicing from its ruined face. But there were too many, a wave of ravenous shadow that crashed over me in an overwhelming surge. Claws raked my flesh and fetid jaws clamped on my limbs, bearing me down into the loamy earth. I fought with the fury of the hopelessly outnumbered, pummeling and gouging and twisting, but it was no use. An inexorable mass of writhing, pustulant forms pinned me, and I could feel the watchers' steaming pants, smell their carrion breath. I screamed then, a raw animal sound of terror and despair. The forest swallowed it, indifferent to my suffering. In that moment, I knew with searing clarity that I was alone, forsaken, my fate sealed by my own harrowing curiosity. The Alpha Watcher loomed over me, its distorted face split into a death's head grin. I saw my own reflection in its mirrored eyes, small and broken, a mote of warm life to be snuffed out on a whim. It raised one great taloned paw, strings of verdant saliva dripping from its maw. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the killing blow. But it never came. Instead, a violent concussion rocked the forest, a blinding pulse of searing light. Sizzling ozone filled my nostrils and I could feel the watchers recoil, their limbs shivering and twitching spasmodically. I opened my eyes to pandemonium. Strobing red and blue lit the trees in a lurid light show, and I could make out dark shapes pouring from between the trunks, men in tactical gear, faces grim behind night vision goggles. They fanned out in a practiced sweep, barking terse commands. The watchers scattered like roaches before a flame, melting into the underbrush with hissing cries of rage and dismay. In seconds, the clearing was still again, nothing moving save the drift of kicked-up leaves settling back to earth. A face swam into my field of vision, creased with concern behind a plexiglass visor. "Jesus, Novak. You lucky son of a bitch. Hang on, we'll get you out of here." I opened my mouth to reply, but darkness was rushing up to greet me, an inexorable wave of oblivion. The last thing I remember before it claimed me was a sense of profound, knee-weakening relief. Against all odds, I was saved, plucked from the Watcher's jaws by this mysterious cavalry. But even as I slipped into merciful unconsciousness, a single conviction coiled in the pit of my gut, cold and certain. This wasn't over. The Watchers were still out there, nursing their wounds and their rage. They had marked me, and they would not rest until I was theirs, mind, body, and soul. My long, harrowing journey in the forest was at an end. But an altogether more terrible trial was about to begin, fought not among the familiar dark of the trees, but in the uncharted shadows of my own mind. For the Watcher's song still echoed in my head, and dreams, hideous visions of gnarled hands and glinting teeth, rising from the black depths to drag me back down. I awoke to white walls and antiseptic, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor counting out the meter of my continued existence. For a long moment, I simply lay there, marveling at the miraculous solidity of the hospital bed, the miraculous absence of rending teeth and grasping claws. It seemed impossible that I could be here, safe and relatively whole, after my ordeal in the forest's dark heart. The memories crowded close, hammering at the ramparts of my shaky calm, the wet heat of the Watcher's breath, the meaty stench of their fur, those glinting eyes filled with callous malevolence. I shuddered, bile rising in my throat, and forced the images away. Later, there would be time to process, to try and slot the horrors I'd witnessed into some kind of rational framework. For now, all I wanted was to bask in the light, in the sweet certainty of my own survival. A soft knock at the door punctured my reverie, and I looked up to see a nurse in pale scrubs poke her head into the room. She smiled when she saw me awake, her face warm with relief. "Welcome back, Ranger Novak. You've been through quite an ordeal. How are you feeling?" I opened my mouth to reply, but all that emerged was a dry croak. The nurse was at my side in an instant, pressing a cup of blessedly cool water into my hand. I gulped it down greedily, feeling it soothe my abraded throat. "Better," I managed finally, my voice a harsh rasp. What happened? How did I get here?" The nurse's smile faltered, replaced by a look of concern. "You were brought in by a search and rescue team early this morning. You were in pretty bad shape. Deep lacerations, blood loss, early-stage sepsis. It's a miracle they found you when they did." I frowned, trying to recall the events leading up to my rescue. The memories were fragmented, jumbled, tainted by pain and terror. Running, endless running, the baying of the Watchers at my heels, falling, clawing hands, hot breath and gleaming teeth. And then, light, noise, salvation, in the form of grim-faced men in tactical gear. "There was a team," I said slowly, brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. They drove off the creatures. Saved me." The nurse's expression turned guarded, almost wary. "Creatures? I'm not sure I understand. The report said you were alone when they found you, injured and delirious." A sinking feeling took root in my gut, cold tendrils of unease unfurling in my belly. "No, that's not. There were things out there. In the woods. They attacked me, would have killed me if—" I broke off, seeing the look in the nurse's eyes. It was a look I was all too familiar with, one I'd seen directed at the occasional lost hiker babbling about lights in the sky or shadowy figures in the trees. The look reserved for madmen and fools. "Ranger Novak," the nurse said gently, "you've been through a severe trauma. It's not uncommon for the mind to play tricks in such situations, to conjure threats where none exist. What you experienced was real," I snapped, more forcefully than I'd intended. "I know how it sounds, but I swear to you, there are things in that forest, things that aren't natural." The nurse sighed, her expression sliding from wary to pitying. I could practically see the word forming on her lips. Delusions. Paranoid delusions brought on by injury, infection, isolation. The first slip down the slope to madness. Frustration welled in my chest, hot and potent. How could I make her understand? How could mere words convey the mind-bending wrongness of the watchers, the primal, paralyzing terror of being stalked by something that belonged in nightmare, not reality? But even as I opened my mouth to argue, to try and somehow hammer the impossible truth into a shape that could be understood, a small, insidious voice whispered in the back of my skull. What if she's right? What if it was all just a fever dream, the hallucinations of an overworked mind finally cracking under the strain? I felt suddenly dizzy, my certainty wavering. The memories, so vivid and visceral moments before, took on a dreamlike quality, fuzzy about the edges. Had I really seen those glinting, pitiless eyes? Felt the steaming pant of fetid breath on my skin? Or had it been a trick of shadow and moonlight? Twigs and branches twisted into monstrous shapes by a mind drowning in its own stress hormones. The nurse must have seen the doubt in my face, the hesitation. She patted my hand, her smile kind and a bit condescending. Get some rest, Ranger Novak. Things will seem clearer after you've had a chance to recover. She bustled out, leaving me alone with my whirling thoughts. I sank back against the pillows, exhaustion tugging at my eyelids like leaden weights. But rest was a long time coming as I stared at the ceiling, trying to shore up my crumbling convictions. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. The pain, the terror, had been real. The watchers were real. I clung to that certainty, that fundamental truth, even as the sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital room tried to leech it away, to replace it with comforting notions of stress and delusion. But even as I finally drifted into an uneasy doze, lulled by the soft mechanical drone of the medical equipment, I couldn't quite banish that whispering doubt, that insidious voice that wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, the true threat lurked not out in the dark of the forest, but in the shadowed recesses of my own mind. It was a long time before sleep claimed me, and when it did, it brought no respite, only visions of glinting eyes and grasping claws, rising from the black depths of my subconscious to drag me back down into the primal dark. The days that followed passed in a haze of painkillers and uneasy sleep, my waking hours haunted by fragmented memories and crawling unease. The hospital staff were unfailingly polite, their smiles just a bit too bright, their voices just a bit too soothing. I could see the wariness in their eyes, the unspoken questions hanging in the air between us. What had really happened out there in the forest? Had I truly been attacked by some unnatural creature? Or had it all been the product of a mind unraveled by isolation and misfortune? The doctors couched their inquiries in gentle euphemisms, altered mental status, atypical stress response. But I could read between the lines. They thought I was crazy, or at least teetering on the brink, and maybe they were right. In the cold light of day, safe behind antiseptic walls and reinforced doors, my memories of that night in the woods took on a surreal, phantasmagoric quality. Had those glinting eyes and grasping claws been real, or just fever dreams conjured by a brain drowning in adrenaline and infection? Had the watchers ever truly existed outside the shadowed corners of my own psyche? The more I turned it over in my mind, the less certain I became. The details that had seemed so vivid, so viscerally real in the moment, blurred and ran like watercolors, leaving only vague impressions of dread and disorientation. Maybe the doctors were right. Maybe it had all been a delusion, a stress response gone haywire. But even as I tried to convince myself of this comforting fiction, there remained a kernel of doubt, a nagging certainty that tugged at the edges of my unraveling conviction. Because hallucination or not, something had happened out there in the forest. Something had left me broken and bleeding, teetering on the brink of death. That, at least, was indisputable. As my wounds healed and my strength returned, I found myself growing restless, chafing against the cloying confines of the hospital. I needed to get out, to return to the forest and confront whatever lurked in its shadowed depths, be it monster or madness. Only then would I know for sure. Would I be able to quiet the doubts gnawing at my mind like rats in the walls? Against the vehement protests of the doctors, I checked myself out, stubbornly ignoring their dire warnings and thinly veiled references to further evaluation. Let them think what they would. I knew I wasn't crazy. I couldn't be. Because if the Watchers were just a figment of my shattered psyche, then that meant the true threat, the real monster, was me. The drive back to the forest was a tense, silent affair. The only sound the growl of tires on asphalt and the erratic thud of my own heart. As the tree line loomed closer, dark and impenetrable, I felt a creeping dread settle over me like a shroud, a primal recognition of the horrors that lurked within. Fever dream or not, some part of me knew this place, knew the nightmares it held. I parked at the trailhead, the ranger station dark and deserted, and sat for a long moment, staring out at the whispering expanse of woodland. In the dying light of evening, the trees seemed to twist and writhe, their shadows reaching out across the loam like grasping fingers. For a moment, I was gripped by an almost overpowering urge to put the car in reverse, to flee this place and never look back, madness be damned. But I couldn't. I had to know, had to see for myself, one way or another. With a deep, shuddering breath, I gathered the tattered remnants of my courage and stepped out of the car. The forest closed around me like a suffocating fist, the air heavy with the scent of rotting leaves and something far more foul, an undercurrent of carrion and sour musk that set my teeth on edge. Despite the lateness of the hour, the woods were unnaturally still, no birdsong or insect choir to break the oppressive silence. I walked as if in a dream, my feet carrying me down the old service road of their own volition. Rationally, I knew I should be terrified, every nerve and instinct screaming at me to flee. But a strange, fatalistic calm had settled over me, a grim sense that whatever was going to happen was inevitable, ordained. It wasn't long before I smelled it, that wet dog reek that triggered a cascade of awful memories, of pain and terror and glinting eyes in the dark. It grew stronger as I walked, an almost physical presence that coated the back of my throat like oil. By the time I reached the old campground, it was overpowering, so thick I could barely draw breath through it. And then I saw them, slipping from between the trees, padding out onto the overgrown asphalt on silent, splay-toed feet. The Watchers. Just as I remembered them, all rangy muscle under matted fur, those awful, distorted faces with their glinting, mirror-black eyes. They filled the clearing, more than I had ever seen, all staring at me with that cool, assessing malevolence. The Alpha emerged from their midst, its muzzle stained with old blood, and fixed me with a gaze that seemed to strip me to the bone. "Watcher," it hissed, its voice like gravel in a blender. "You return. Foolish. Breath and blood and breaking bone. We hunger." It crept forward, muscles bunching beneath its mangy pelt, and in that moment, I knew my answer. The Watchers were real. Terrifyingly, nauseatingly real. This was no hallucination, no fever dream. The true monsters were here, in the flesh, and they were coming for me. A laugh bubbled up my throat, high and hysterical, and shot through with the jagged edge of madness. Because it was funny, wasn't it? All this time spent questioning my own sanity, doubting the evidence of my senses, when the truth had been right here, waiting in the woods. The Watchers drew closer, their eyes glinting with anticipation, and I knew I should be afraid. Should be screaming, running, fighting for my life. But all I could feel was a strange, giddy relief. It was real. I wasn't crazy. I raised my arms, welcoming as the Watchers surged forward, their jaws slavering. Yes, this was it. The end, but also a validation. Proof that I wasn't insane, that the world was far stranger and more terrible than I had ever dared imagine. As their teeth caught my skin, iron-hard fingers locking around my limbs, a single cry emerged from my throat. A laugh, wild, broken, exultant. The sound rang out across the forest as the watchers bore me down into darkness and pain. A final defiant cry in the face of an uncaring universe. The shadows took me then, and I felt myself unraveling, my mind coming apart like a frayed knot. But one thought remained, crystalline and triumphant in the wreckage. I had faced the abyss, the lurking madness that haunted the spaces between the trees. And in the end, it was not my sanity that had broken, but the comforting lie of a rational world. As I slipped into the waiting dark, I clung to that revelation, that fundamental truth. Let them find me, broken and rent. Just another mysterious disappearance in a forest with a long, hungry history. Let them spin their tales of predators and misadventure, of tragic accidents and troubled minds. I knew the truth. The Watchers were real. And in a way, that was the greatest gift they could have given me. After all, a madman dies frightened and confused, lost in the labyrinth of his own shattered psyche. But I would die enlightened,